we've been spending God knows how much time and money trying to cure autistic people, or thinking about vaccines, or thinking about, which is just not true, just that whole lie about vaccines. And we've wasted a lot of time. And that must mean, I'm a political journalist. I thought that must mean we have a lot of bad policies about autism.
Eric Garcia is a Washington, D.C.-based journalist focused on politics and policy, and currently the senior Washington correspondent for The Independent. He's the author of We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. He's autistic, and we'll talk about what led him to write the book, how autism has affected his life and career, the supports he found helpful along the way, and more. It's April, Autism Acceptance Month 2022, and straight ahead, episode 120. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
A reminder that the Bright and Quirky Summit 2022 is going on now, and I'm proud to join with a large panel of experts to bring information and ideas that will help you support bright, neurodivergent kids. There's still time to join us and take advantage of this free event. It lasts through April 8th, but I've heard rumors that there might be an encore weekend a few days after that. If you can't make it now, you can still get all of the content for a small price afterwards. The link is in the show notes of this episode or on our website, neurodiversitypodcast.com. It's going on now, so get registered and join us. Eric Garcia is coming up next.
Identifying, supporting, and challenging gifted and twice exceptional students is often difficult for school districts. But Emily Kircher-Morris's new book, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom, provides guidelines and a unique approach for identifying and understanding 2E students. It includes strategies that will help educators and administrators provide strength-based instruction, motivate twice exceptional learners, and even help them with self-regulation. It contains important information to help educators advocate for 2E students, including things you need to know about individualized education plans and the Section 504 plan process. This important new book is now available. Go to neurodiversitypodcast.com for links to get your copy. Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom from Free Spirit Publishing.
You're listening to the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
I am really excited to welcome today's guest. In addition to being a journalist covering politics in D.C., Eric Garcia is the author of the book We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation, where he chronicles shifts in how we as a society view and support autistic individuals. He is also openly autistic. So, Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we re-released our interview with Steve Silberman earlier this week as our launch for Autism Acceptance Month. And I know that you view Steve's book, Neurotribes, as a real influence on your book.
Without his book, that wouldn't be my book. Just for example, when I was doing my book research, if you can see, your viewers can't see, but like I have so many highlighters, bookmarks, and tabs, things tabulated on when I was researching my book. So, that's just a testament to how influential his book was to my book. So I have nothing but love in the world for Steve Silberman.
Yeah, he's wonderful. He's wonderful. Tell us a little bit more about just how your book came to be. So Steve wrote his book, I think,
2015.
Yeah.
So I started writing about autism. Initially, I was, as you said, I was a reporter. I covered politics in my day job. I was happy to do that for the rest of my life, covering economics and politics. And I was a reporter at National Journal at the time, covering economic policy. And I went to a party by a guy by the name of Tim Mack. He's now a reporter at NPR. He was a reporter at the Daily Beast at the time. And he offered me a drink. And I said, oh, I don't drink because I'm on the autism spectrum. And the medicine I take doesn't mix with alcohol. And instead of him saying, oh, come on, have a drink, he said, oh, there's a lot of autistic people in Washington, D.C. You should write a piece about that. I thought, when I get good enough as a reporter, I'll do that. But like right now, I just want to focus on doing my job. Then what happened was I was at National Journal and the print magazine was going to shut down. So my editor, Richard Just, said, I want just kind of these go for broke pieces. So I pitched that idea to him, and he said, yeah, great. Initially, I thought it would be kind of like a talk of the town piece, like the secret lives of autistic people in Washington, kind of like something like that. And then, I kind of liked that he did this. He's like, why does this piece need to exist? And I said, well, I think we focus too much on trying to cure autistic people and not enough on trying to help them live fulfilling lives. So he's like, there's your piece, go. So I wrote that piece for National Journal. And then the next logical question, person who became my agent reached out to me. I met her through Ron Fournier, who was my colleague at National Journal and my friend. And she said, do you want to turn this into a book? And initially, I think there was kind of this idea that it would be kind of a memoir, but then I realized, well, I'm not that interesting enough. I was only in my 20s when that came out, so I was like, I'm not going to do a memoir. But then I thought, we've been spending God knows how much time and money trying to cure autistic people, or thinking about vaccines, or thinking about, which is just not true, just that whole lie about vaccines. And we've wasted a lot of time. And that must mean, and I'm a political journalist, I thought that must mean we have a lot of bad policies about autism. And that must mean we're not really well serving autistic people. So, and if you remember, this was around 2015, 2016, around this time, it was really interesting because that was the time when Hillary Clinton had just put out her autism policy. I think it was the first policy platform by a presidential candidate specifically focused on autism. And that was really monumental. And at the same time, you saw that Donald Trump was running for president, and he was saying that autism is an epidemic. He blamed the vaccines. He spouted a lot of nonsense. But my feeling was, okay, Trump is Trump. And that was kind of how we lived our lives for the next 6 years, just saying Trump is Trump. But especially political journalists. But my feeling was, okay, yeah, Trump is who he is, but there are a lot of people who believe the same thing that he believes. And he wouldn't have gotten that had there not been this germ of a bad idea and a conspiracy theory that a lot of people, including a lot of very liberal people, I grew up in Southern California, a lot of very liberal hippies in Southern California who are afraid of the toxins believe. So my feeling was, wow, we don't have a lot of good ideas about autism. So as a result, I hit the road. And I traveled across the country to try to get a better understanding of what autism looks like.
Yeah.
And also, how do we misunderstand autism, and how do those misunderstandings hurt autistic people?
Yeah. And I think you really made some interesting observations, I think, about the evolution of how we understand autism. And I know kind of conceptualizing the different generations of autistic individuals. And there's been so many changes in how we view autism in the last 30 years plus. How do you define those generational differences?
Oh, good question. Well, I would even argue in the last 5 years we've changed our understanding about autism. The last 10 years, if we want to be, if we're being honest. I think it's important to recognize that initially when autism was first, discussed in 1908, 1911 by Eugen Bleuler, who was a Swiss psychiatrist, he saw it as a symptom of schizophrenia. The term aut is like auto, like self. And it was mostly, I think, to refer to withdrawn children. And again, this is why if you go back and read a lot of newspaper articles or magazine articles about autism, you'll hear the words autism and childhood schizophrenia almost kind of used interchangeably. And I think that affected how we viewed autism. We saw it as a mental illness. And that's not to say that it's bad to be mentally ill. It's just that was how it was characterized. And similarly, I think for a long time, there was this idea that clinicians and psychiatrists, those were the experts. And more importantly, I think that they were the ones who spread this idea that parents were the cause of their children being autistic. This is how you get people like Bruno Bettelheim talking about refrigerator mothers and comparing parents to Nazi prison guards, so that's fun. And then I think what happened is, around the 1960s and the 1970s, you saw, I'd say in a lot of ways with great intentions, parents begin to become the gatekeepers on autism. This is when you see the National Society for Autistic Children, what it was called, which would eventually become the Autism Society of America. People like Ruth Christ Sullivan, people like Bernard Rimland, really becoming the authorities on autism. And I think that was a sea change in of itself. And it was in some ways parents taking the power back. But I think at the same time, what it also did is it made parents the experts rather than autistic people. And in some ways, it had some windfalls because I think that was how you got autism included in the Developmental Disabilities Act. But as a result of that, autism as a disability rights movement really wound up playing catch up because like this was in the 1970s. What was this all going on in the 1970s? This was like, the 504 sit-ins and the rest of the disability rights movement. So autism was really not, autistic people were not really a part of that openly. They were not part of those movements that were the 504 sit-ins, which led to the Capitol climb, which led to the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individual Disabilities Education Act. But then something happened, I think, was that all of those landmark achievements, even though autistic people weren't in mind with them, they wound up benefiting from them because what happened was children, including, and I'm part of this generation, I was born in 1990, the year that President Bush signed the ADA. They benefited from the Americans with Disabilities Act. They benefited from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was a reauthorization of the Education for Handicapped Children Act. Autism was specifically included in the Individual with Disabilities Education Act as a covered disability. So you saw a lot more autistic people getting diagnosed. You saw a lot more autistic people getting services. Those services were far from what they needed, but they were a taste. And I think that what you're seeing now is you're seeing that first generation that had an understanding of themselves as a group of people with rights is now growing up or has grown up. And so now you're starting to see, I think, autistic people start to wrest control and start to assert themselves. So I think that you could define autism's history in the public eye. And of course, autism has likely been around as long as there have been human beings. But the public understanding for the past century really is split into three, I think you could say, three distinct eras.
And now young people who we're just much better at recognizing some of those characteristics and empowering them with self-advocacy. And there's a whole different perspective on it, which is really empowering for autistic people.
Yeah, these kids now, I think that now you see, especially when I don't use TikTok. I tried using TikTok. I'm just not that good at it. But like if you see autistic kids on TikTok, things like that, they have a much more, like my generation, so I'm 31, we're kind of like a sandwich generation. You know how they talk about like the Oreo generation of adults where like their parents had them when they were relatively older and then they had kids relatively young, so they wound up taking care of. In a lot of ways, my generation of autistic people is kind of like an Oreo generation. Is also kind of like the last generation that remembers what life was like before the internet became a daily part of our lives. And then, but we also, lived mostly with, most of my life, I've known about the internet, more than half my life. So in the same way, I think that the generation after me, the generation that'll come after both of us, the Gen Zers and kids like that, they're going to have a much firmer understanding about their identity as autistic people than I ever did or people who came before me ever did. And that is going to be a very interesting thing to see in the next few years.
Yeah. Yeah. And you describe yourself as someone who doesn't exactly fit the stereotype of autism. What do you think people think autism looks like?
I think a lot of people think of autism, they think of typically a child, typically white, typically with blonde hair, typically suburban. I mean, I'm a guy, so that's one thing that I fit in the stereotype with. Typically either very socially withdrawn, typically, either unable to work or someone who works in Silicon Valley. I don't fit any of those stereotypes. I'm Latino. I don't work in Silicon Valley. I suck at computer coding. I tried it. I got a C- in it. And typically, I think a lot of people don't see autistic people as adults. We mostly think of them as children. So I think that those are the ways that I defy the stereotypes. But I think that it's important to recognize that autistic children grow up. For a long time, that wasn't seen as possible. It was interesting because they just thought it was, again, because of the schizophrenia thing. It was interesting. I remember reading in like a 1986 LA Times article about Temple Grandin, and it said like the first memoir of a recovered autistic adult. They just did that was just not seen as a possibility. And I think that those stereotypes or those myths still, I mean, 35 years later, probably still persist. Not probably still, they do persist. So I think those are some ways that I defy the stereotypes.
I know also you had some experiences going through college and overcoming a fear of requesting and accepting accommodations. And I think that's something that will really resonate with our audience because we have a lot of parents and educators who listen, but a lot of kids who do pretty well academically, especially when they're young, and then they're not really comfortable asking for help.
Yeah, I mean, it's overcoming ableism, isn't it?
Yes.
It's interesting because like I was interviewing this one young man. Well, he's not a young man; he's my age. Timotheus Gordon. He's based in Chicago, and he was saying that because he went through the kind of labyrinth of asking for services when he was, in K-12. By the time he went to university, he's just like, screw this. And I think that's the attitude a lot of autistic people and a lot of people with disabilities once they get to college is like, screw this. I remember how much my parents had to fight for IEP. I remember how much stuff we had to be dragged through just to get just this much. So I think there's that element, but then I think also there's this element of ableism, which is there's multiple angles to ableism, right? There's the feeling of, oh, well, I must not, because I'm in college, I must not be really disabled. And I think a lot of our educators and our professors say that. They're like, you can't be disabled because you're here. And that says a lot about academia and how ableist academia is, that there's this idea that people with disabilities can't go to university. Well, the reason why we can't go to it is because it's so ableist, and it's because there's so many obstacles in there. More people with disabilities could go to college if there were fewer obstacles. Second of all, I think that there's another aspect of internalized ableism, which was we don't want to be seen as getting special treatment. We don't want to have like an asterisk to our success. And I think the last area is that because resources have always been so scarce for people with disabilities, there's this feeling of, oh, well, if I am using these services, I'm taking them away from another person. So it winds up turning asking for services into a zero-sum game. And I can't really speak for why initially when I went to the University of North Carolina. So I'm in mourning right now. My Tar Heels just lost against Kansas, hence why I'm wearing a blue shirt. But I was a community college student, then I transferred to the University of North Carolina. And I think that what I wanted is I didn't want people to. It's like I thought, okay, I want to succeed. I want to do well. I want to actually be. I want my peers to respect me. And I think that was why I didn't ask for services or help initially. Then what happened is I think that I was taking it wasn't even a class for my major. It was a gen ed requirement. It was I took a history of African music class. It's interestingly enough, and I remember studying all night with my classmate. And then what we were supposed to do is they were supposed to play a song from one country in Africa, and you were supposed to match it with that one. And I completely blanked. I tanked that test, and I realized, okay, enough. I need to go to my professor. And this was like the Thursday or Friday before fall break, which was you would get like three days off. Mm-hmm. I went to my professor. I said, look, Professor Pierre, I'm autistic. I need help. And he took it seriously. Like, God bless him. I'll never forget it. He picks up the phone. He calls. He says, student services is waiting for you. Go. And I will love him forever for that.
He opened that door for you.
He opened that door for me, yeah. And that was one of the things that allowed me to kind of overcome my ableism. I mean, it was an ongoing process, and it is an ongoing process. I have to overcome ableism every day, but my own internalized ableism, I should say. But that was the beginning of it. Mm-hmm. And then similarly, I was in my senior year. I was studying journalism, and I had this one professor. His name was Farrell Guillory. Absolute gentleman. I was taking this class called Southern Politics, where every week we had to write a column. And I remember he was just the epitome of a Southern gentleman. Just had like the pressed shirts and the suspenders and the glasses and the wispy white hair. And he had this very thick accent from Louisiana. Looked like something out of All the King's Men. And I remember after I turned in my first column, I got like a B- on it. But like afterward, like I remember one day before class, he's like, "Come on to my office." And I was like, and he closed the door. And I was like, "Am I in trouble?" Then he says, "You don't have to tell me anything." But he's like, "But do you have Asperger's? And professors do not do this. This is like, I think it's against the law, actually. Like, is it like it's like a violation of FERPA or something like that, or like something?"
Yeah.
But so on one end, I wanted to kick his ass, but my response was, "How'd you know?" He says, "I have a loved one who's autistic, who has Asperger's," and he said, "Come to me every week, and we will." It's like, "You have good ideas. Your ideas are good. I just want to help you whittle them down and focus them." And he was also one of those people who, like, he would give me columns to read by like E.J. DeYoung, or he would, give me columns in like the American Prospect or in the New Republic, and then conversely on the other end, he would give me columns from like National Review, like conservative columns and liberal columns. So like, it was that understanding that allowed me to succeed in his class. So I will always love him. He retired just last year, but I love Farrell Guillory from the bottom of my heart.
So you participated in honors college, is that correct?
Yeah, so I went to honors at my community college when I went to JP College. And what was interesting about that, to the point about ableism, is that like I remember my mom asked, she was like, "Will he still get his accessibility stuff?" They said, like, "We don't think we've ever had somebody use disability services in our honors program." That was like, and I was just like, it was like, there certainly have been disabled students in honors programs. They just were too afraid to discuss it. And I mean, that's a problem in and of itself. That shows how exclusive this was. So
yeah, I think that's an area where people are starting to realize that those things aren't mutually exclusive.
They aren't.
They can coexist.
They often do coexist.
One story that really stood out to me was you interviewed a couple who are both autistic and they're raising a family.
Yeah.
And one of the parents was describing their young autistic daughter and noting that while she currently has some higher support needs now while she's young, I think the quote was, "They don't have any idea of what she's capable of yet."
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that. Can you share a little bit about that?
I love Chris and Corey so much. And I think it was really important for me. What was fascinating is that this was an entire family, the mother, the father, all three kids were autistic in one way or another. And it was one of those things where, like, I loved that they started from the baseline assumption that their daughter was competent. Mm-hmm. That is something very rare in parents to begin with. But the fact that they started from that baseline, I think, is a good template for every parent. So I love that Chris and Corey discussed that.
It just is really powerful because it talks about allowing neurodivergent kids to develop just based on their own timeline, that
Yes.
there's no protocol.
Yeah, and not measuring them based on what their peers are doing.
So what do you think are some of the keys to your success over the years? You've mentioned a couple of these influential educators. I don't know if there are any important lessons that you've learned as you became an adult.
Like, my mom started from the assumption that I was going to be competent,
Yeah.
Even after I got my diagnosis. So to that point that I mentioned about Chris and Corey, my mom fought like hell to get services. This wasn't just, through hard work. This was from getting services. This was from getting accommodations. This was from schools intervening, government intervention, employers being understanding, educators being understanding. It's not about my own individual achievement.
Yeah. As we wrap up, my last question to you is this. If you were talking to an autistic person who's trying to make their way through the world and they're frustrated by the barriers
Yes.
and everything that they see ahead of them, what would you want them to hear?
What I want them to hear is that they are good as they are. I'm really good friends with Sarah Marshall, the host of Be Wrong About. Her other podcast is called You Are Good, and it's based off that scene where Gene Wilder's character goes to Peter Boyle's like Frankenstein's monster. He's like, "You are not evil, you are good." And of course Peter Boyle's character monster goes, because like that's all we want to hear is that we're good and we're human, we're wonderful, we're lovely. And what I would want to say is that there's nothing wrong with you, that you're not a failed version of normal, that you're a good human being, and that the world doesn't understand you and that we should work to change the world for you. So I think that's what I would say. One of my favorite quotes I heard from Professor Kayvon Stossen, who's a professor at Vanderbilt University. He has an autistic son. He says, "I wouldn't change my son for the world, so I'll change the world for my son."
Awesome.
So that's what I would say, is that, like, you are a good human being. You are a good and whole and worthy human being.
Eric Garcia, author of We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
You may have noticed some discrepancy lately in the media. Is it Autism Awareness Month or Autism Acceptance Month? Are both of those terms interchangeable? My friend and past guest on this podcast, Amanda Morin, shared this quote on Twitter from her 12-year-old, actually autistic son. "People are aware of me. I want them to accept me, not be aware of me." In Eric's book, he talks about how budgeting reflects values. In 2016, of the over $350 million the U.S. spent on autism research, over half was spent on autism and biology, or identifying risk factors of autism. In contrast, only 2% was spent researching lifespan issues, even though research shows that autistic people have specific needs that impact their lifespan. If we focused on these issues, or issues related to how to support and accommodate autistic people, we'd be moving into the arena of acceptance instead of just awareness. Because after all, shouldn't our focus be on improving the lives of people, instead of just trying to figure out why they exist? I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Flying low under the radar, like a nighthawk stealth plane, you are. Hiding out in the shadows, keeping from the light of day. Nobody should ever have to live that way. Hey now, it's okay now. You don't have to hide from the world no more. Hey now, it's okay now. It's your time to soar.
Thank you to Eric Garcia for joining us. We have links to his website and more info about his book at neurodiversitypodcast.com. Don't forget the Bright and Quirky Summit 2022 is going on now through April 8th, and there is talk of an encore weekend as well. Check our social media feeds for more info. If you get registered and hop on now, it's free, so time is your only investment through April 8th for this important educational and uplifting summit. To register, click the link in the show notes or hop on neurodiversitypodcast.com. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. The executive producer and post-production editor is me, Dave Morris. More episodes ahead for Autism Acceptance Month, so check your podcast feed all during the month of April. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
It's time to stand up straight and step into the light. It's time once and for all to have equal rights. Come along now. Hey now, it's okay now.
This podcast is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.